Hey, welcome back. Today we'll be talking about Dante's Paradiso, cantos 27 through 29, as we approach the final moments of Paradiso. When we last left off, Dante was talking with Adam and talking about Adam's time and language during his moments in the Garden of Eden. Canto 27 opens with all of heaven's response to Adam's speech. Unto the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, glory, all paradise began, so that the sweetness of the singing held me rapt. What I saw seemed to me to be a smile, the universe had smiled. My rapture had entered by way of hearing and of sight. Dante literally feels drunk from the joy that he's experiencing, listening and seeing all of paradise rejoicing. And he emphasizes both aspects of sight and hearing. This sets us up for what St. Peter is going to do in just a moment. Peter steps forward and begins to shine brighter than all the rest. But as he shines, he also transforms from pale to red. And while all else falls silent, Peter says, "If I change color, do not be amazed, for as I speak you will see change in all these flames. He who on earth usurps my place, that in the sight of God's own Son is vacant now, has made my burial ground a sewer of blood, a sewer of stench, so that the perverse one who fell from hell here above can find contentment there below." Peter is going to begin a tirade here about the popes and the corruption of the papal seat, particularly aimed at Boniface VIII. In fact, this is maybe one of the strongest speeches of condemnation against Boniface. Peter, after all, is recognized as the first of the popes, and so his horror at the way the popes are mistreating the church is particularly poignant here. He points out that his seat is vacant. What that means is a little bit ambiguous. It might be that Boniface doesn't deserve the place, or it might hint at the fact that the popes are beginning to migrate farther and farther north. Instead of staying in Rome, they're going to France, which is going to lead to the Great Schism in just a few years. But there's that acknowledgement of Satan's joy at the corruption of the popes, the way he is gleefully enjoying the destruction of the church. We're going to recognize Satan again in just a few moments when we start talking about angels. And as Dante's listening to this, suddenly all of the congregation of heaven begins to change color and glow red as well. And it's like watching a sunrise or a sunset. And Beatrice also blushes in this moment, just like a modest lady will blush when hearing something inappropriate. And as Peter begins to speak, his voice begins to change. Again, that transformation of sight as well as hearing. Then he continued speaking as before, his voice so changed, so charged with indignation, that his appearance could not darken more. Peter cries out against the death of martyrs, and especially popes who suffered for their faith, is being abused here. He condemns the factions that are encouraged by the Pope, including the same sort of dissension that led to the destruction of Florence through the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and the White Guelphs and the Black Guelphs. Peter also condemns the war against Christians. Here's Pope Boniface VIII, who's fighting against his own Christian people for his own political gain, such as his campaigns against the Colonnas. He also cries that his face is being used on the stamp to do all of these wicked things. From here in every pasture, fold, and hill we see wolves dressed as shepherds. O hand of God, mankind's defender, why do you yet lie still? Gascons and Carhorsines are couched to drink our very blood. O excellent beginning, to what foulest conclusion will you sink? He references the French church leaders who are taking more and more power away from Rome. And Peter's tirade ends with two interesting points. First, he prophesies that imperial power will help to straighten things out. Give the politics back to Rome and stop dabbling in politics, popes. It's the corruption of power that's led to so many problems, as we've seen all throughout the Divine Comedy. Dante truly believes in the empire, and that the strong political leaders can help to keep everyone on course. He also believes that spiritual leaders should be spiritual leaders, not corrupt political leaders. And also, Peter points directly at Dante and gives him an admonition to carry this message back to earth. Switching back to Mindelbaum. And you, my son, who through your mortal weight will yet return below, speak plainly there, and do not hide that which I do not hide. Dante is being called to be a prophet. Dante is being put in the position of Jeremiah. He is called to carry a message back to the people. We've seen Dante in that particular position back when we were talking about Boniface all the way down in the Inferno, in Canto 19, when he's talking to Pope Nicholas. This is in fact the third time that Dante is called to be a prophet. The last time was with Cacciaguida, his grandfather. And before that, at the top of Purgatory, Beatrice had called him to prophesy. He's got a message to carry back, and he can't hold back even if the message is really intense and hard. At this point, there is a moment when all of the souls all throughout here begin to drift back up towards the Empyrean, but very quickly. And Dante describes it as a reverse snowfall, because ultimately God is the center of all gravity. Everything pulls towards him. And Dante watches them all drift up until he can no longer see them. At that point, Beatrice says, it's time to look back at Earth again. Remember how we looked back at Earth at the beginning of this section and got a sense of perspective after coming all this way. Dante looks down to see that about 6 hours have passed since he arrived in the starry sphere. And he describes the position of Earth, noting 2 events. One, where Ulysses made his mad course, and 2, where Europa was a sweet burden. Recalling these 2 myths recalls us to the central sin of each one, the pride and the lust. 2 things that Dante hopes to have left behind at this point. 2 things that might reflect Dante's journey here. Ulysses' pride led him to a great journey, but Dante, by letting go of his pride, has risen up to this height. And Europa pursued lust and desire. Dante's desire ultimately was purified and led him to a pure love in this point. Speaking of that love that drew Dante here, he turns his eyes back to Beatrice. My mind, which ever found its paradise in thinking of my lady, now more than ever burned with desire to look into her eyes. And there's nothing on earth that can describe the beauty of his delight at the moment when he looks upon her smile again. And as he's looking at her smile, he finds that they have been lifted up to the next sphere. Here we come to the 9th and final sphere before the Empyrean. This is the Primum Mobile, and it's so uniform that Dante can't identify where they have entered it, but he is looking around and Beatrice clarifies what this is for him. The nature of the universe, which holds the center still and moves all else around it, begins here, as if from its turning post. This heaven has no other where than this, the mind of God, in which are kindled both the love that turns it and the force it reigns. As in a circle, light and love enclose it, and it surrounds the rest. And that enclosing, only he who encloses understands. No other heaven measures this sphere's motion, but it serves as the measure for the rest. So the 9th sphere is really outside of everything, encompassing everything, and also inside the mind of God. And that's going to be important as I get to some complicated ideas about the angels we're about to get to. This is also the place from which all time and space come. It is the first mover, literally. And so from it come all other motions, all time. Beyond this sphere, we come to the center where God is, which we'll do in Canto 30. Dante used the imagery of a plant with roots down inside a pot. And the roots of all time are in this particular section. He's going to use foliage metaphors for a few more minutes, because at this point, Beatrice is going to have a long aside to finish out this canto. She describes both the limits of human perspective, that we can't understand all of this, but also that our perspectives become more and more tainted with greed and selfishness. And she describes how children are sweet and innocent, but by the time they have grown into any kind of maturity, they have been corrupted, and they have lost their devotion to God, and they have lost their respect for their parents. And as she describes this corruption, she shifts it to a prophecy, ultimately of the imperial restoration and renewal from corruption. Whereas humanity's goodness is blighted and rotten, if the empire rises and is strengthened, then all shall see first blossom turn to good fruit on the tree. Dante is still listening with rapture to Beatrice's prophecy, how things will get better when the empire straightens things out, as we shift into Canto 28. And as he's looking at her, he sees a reflection in her eye, which immediately makes him turn before he even thinks about it. And there he sees this point of light. I saw a point that flashed a beam of light so sharp the eye on which it burns must close against its piercing brightness. The star that, seen from here below, seems smallest would seem a moon if put beside it, as when one star is set beside another. So this point of light is so bright you can't look at it without being blinded. But it is also so tiny. It is the absolute densest point of light. This is a representation of God, a vision of God. And Dante can't keep looking at it, but there are halos all around it, 9 of them. They are spinning around this point of light, which is God. In Chardy's notes, he calls God the non-dimensional essence. And Dante is sort of surprised by what he sees here because these rings surrounding this central point of light are bigger as they go out, but also faster as they are near the center. So the one in the middle is really spinning, but as they go out, they spin slower and slower. Beatrice says, "From that point depend the heavens and all nature. Observe that circle nearest it, and understand its motion is so swift because it is spurred on by flaming love." So the speed represents the intensity of love. So the closest to the point love the most. But Dante is a bit confused, because in nature, normally, things that are farther out are going to spin faster than the ones in the center. How come this doesn't reflect natural order? Dante thinks that natural order usually reflects the divine, and therefore they should mirror each other. I still need to learn exactly why the model and copy fail to follow the same plan. For using my own powers, I reflect on this in vain. Beatrice says, "You're right, it's a really hard problem. Let me go ahead and explain it to you." And then she explains it to us. It's really hard. Okay, so I read 4 translations and 3 commentaries trying to wrap my mind around what these 15 lines are saying. Some of it's obvious. If you are pure in goodness, then the bigger you are, the better. Because 1 cubic inch of pure goodness is 1 cubic inch of pure goodness, and 1 cubic foot of pure goodness is a lot more pure goodness. So bigger is better. So that, if you apply your measure, not to their appearances, but to the powers themselves of the angels that appear to you in circles, you will see a marvelous congruence, larger with more, smaller with less, in each sphere according to its celestial intelligence. This sphere, therefore, which sweeps into its motion the rest of the universe, must correspond to the ring that loves and knows the most. Part of that was hard for me, because here in the Primum Mobile, he is seeing the 9 spheres. And yet, the Primum Mobile is a sphere. So when you realize these 9 spheres that he's seeing here are a vision to help him understand the 9 spheres that he's just passed through, and the angels whose power is reflected in those spheres, then it becomes clearer. In the Primum Mobile, he is seeing the 9 ranks of angels, each one associated with a sphere, and each one reflecting greater and greater love for God the closer they are to the center. So the Primum Mobile is the biggest, and turns the fastest, and shows the most love. Dante's like, yeah, I get it, and the angels begin to shoot sparks everywhere in their joy at what Beatrice just said. And Dante is stunned by just the immensity of what he sees. More and more angels. The number just keeps growing. And he references this story about a king who is supposed to pay by doubling the amount of grain he put on each of the squares of a chessboard up to 64. And you know, when you start playing with exponential numbers, you lose a lot of grain really fast. The mind-blowing number of the final chess square reminds Dante of the mind-blowing number of all these angels he's seeing up here. And then Beatrice goes ahead and explains to him the order and hierarchy of angels. There are 3 groups of 3. If you haven't figured out Dante's love of numbers, especially the number 3, I don't know what to do. The first 3 are the seraphim, the cherubim, and the thrones. The thrones, incidentally, were already associated back in Canto 9 with the idea of justice. So here we have the first 2 groups of angels, the seraphim and the cherubim, who are reflecting God's love and truth. And underneath them we have the third group, the thrones, who are reflecting God's justice. And Beatrice points out, because these 3 groups of angels are the closest to God, they most truly reflect the truth of God. They can see him the clearest. And you should know that all of them delight in measure of the depth to which their sight can penetrate the truth, where every intellect finds rest. From this, it may be seen, beatitude itself is based upon the act of seeing, not on that of love, which follows after. And the measure of their sight reveals their worth with grace and power will beget in them. Such then is the process step by step. She points out that love stems from a knowledge of perfect truth, and that definitely we are increasing in love, but also love doesn't exist without the truth. She then talks about the second triad, the dominions, the virtues, and the powers. And finally, the third triad, the principalities, the archangels, and the angels. All these orders gaze in ecstasy above, the highest that are linked with those below, so that the rest are drawn and also draw to God. It's like one giant power cell. God is pouring out love and truth on all these angels, and they are drawing towards him, and they're drawing others towards them. Canto 28 ends with a discrepancy between two people who had a different order for the lists of angels. Dionysius, who knew St. Paul, and as we know, St. Paul had seen a vision of heaven, has the correct order, whereas Gregory had it incorrect. And Gregory, when he died and woke up in heaven and realized what had happened, he laughed at his mistake. Which again shows the need for divine understanding, divine revelation, not just human understanding. The last canto set in the Primum Mobile is Canto 19, and Beatrice continues to stare at that point of perfect light and smile for a moment in silence, and then she turns to Dante to answer his questions, which she was reading in the light of God. Because in the light of God, there is all things. Therefore, she could see Dante's mind there. Dante wants to know more about the creation of the angels, where they come from and why God created them. She starts with a why. Not to increase his store of goodness, a thing impossible, but that his splendor shining back might say subsisto in his eternity, beyond time, beyond any other limit, as it pleased him in these new loves, eternal love unfolded. So God can't increase his goodness because he is already perfect in his goodness. But by creating other loves, these angels, there is another place for his goodness to subsist and to reflect. And what did God do before he created all of this? Well, there was no before, and so it's a silly question. Time began the moment of creation. When God set the Primum Mobile in place, that's when time began to spin. And in fact, he had all creation at once, including the angels. Dante talks about the three arrows on the string: pure form, pure matter, and form mixed with matter. So they're sort of like the stuff that all is created of. There is the perfect form of all things, and then there's the mix between the two. Some have seen this as the earth, and especially the formless earth, at the moment at the beginning of creation. The angels, who are the idea or form, and then the in-between, when things blended into their shape. There are lots of other interpretations, and they're complicated. I recommend Hollander's notes if you want to go deep. So Dante says that the creation of the angels happened at the same time as the creation of everything else. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense, because the angel's purpose would have been left unfulfilled for however long if they had been created first and then just left there to sit until everything else was made. This is in direct contradiction of Jerome. Beatrice also tells Dante that the fallen angels fell basically as soon as they were created. There were only 20 seconds between the time of their creation and their fall to earth. So humanity had 6 hours, angels almost instantaneous. But not specifically instantaneous. God didn't create them evil, they just turned evil really fast. Why? Because of the pride of Satan. The cause accounting for the fall was the accursed pride of him you saw crushed beneath the weight of all the world. These, whom you observe here, all were humble, acknowledging the goodness that had made them fit to be endowed with an intelligence so vast. We have the pride of Satan there in the center of the Inferno, who's laughing down there in the Inferno. Well, technically he's crying in the Inferno. But he's laughing at the corruption that the popes are bringing to the earth. We saw in Canto 27. Here, we see how he's crushed down there, and his pride has dropped him all the way down there. Whereas the angels here reflect humility. And in their humility, they are able to be filled with the goodness of God. Line 64. And I would not have you doubt, but rather be assured that there is merit in receiving grace in measure as the heart inclines to it. The more your heart is open to grace in your humility, the more that gets poured in. At this point, Beatrice says, I've answered enough, you can figure out the rest yourself just by looking at the angels. But then she decides to go on and explain more anyway. Especially since there's a lot of confusing discussions of angels back on Earth. On Earth, they say that angels are possessed of understanding, memory, and will. She says, well, Not necessarily memory, because after all, the angels are standing there looking at God. And just as Beatrice at the beginning of this canto looked at God and saw all that was in Dante's mind, the angels see everything in God, so what's the point of memory? They see all, always, because they never take their faces away from God. These angelic beings, since they first rejoiced in the face of God from which nothing may be hidden, have never turned their eyes away from it, so that their sight is never interrupted by some new object. And thus, they have no need to search the past for some forgotten construct. Not only is Dante playing around with some discussions of angels and how angels work, but he's also limiting the value of memory. Something that's kind of important in this last section where Dante's memory cannot hold all that he sees. Note the way he talks about memory as he looks to Beatrice at the beginning of the next canto. Beatrice takes an aside here to talk about bad preaching on earth. There are all these people who love to talk and love to come up with clever stories to catch their audience's attention and win themselves lots of fame for their quick wit and quick tongues, but all they're doing is really just messing people up. Down there, when you philosophize, you fail to follow one true path. So does the love of show preoccupy your mind and carry you away. She goes on to say that, sure, a distortion of scripture is infinitely worse, but that playful kind of speaking that doesn't actually preach the truth of God's word is really hollow and really selfish. Florence has not as many named Lapo or Bindo as it has tales like these that are proclaimed from the pulpit here and there throughout the year, so that the ignorant flocks return from feeding fed on wind. And that they fail to see their loss does not excuse them. The congregation listening to these preachers who preach idle prattle are fed on wind, nothing. Yet they should realize the hollowness of what they're hearing and seek better words. Christ did not say to his first congregation, "Go preach idle nonsense to the world," but gave to them a sound foundation. Now preachers ply their trade with buffoonery and jokes, their cows inflating if they get a laugh, and the people ask for nothing more. Not only is it a waste of people's time, but it also lends to abuse, and the church leaders doing things like selling pardons. But Beatrice turns back to the angels and says, we're really here to learn about the angels, let's get back on track. And she says that the number of angels is a number that cannot be fathomed by humanity. And there's some debate whether that's infinity or just a number beyond human understanding. In any case, each of them reflects the love of God, as we saw from her answer at the very beginning of this canto. See now the height and breadth of the eternal worth, one light, which shines dispersed among so many mirrors, yet remains in itself one, just as it was before. The beauty of God shining through all of these numberless angels. That brings us to the end of Canto 19. Next time, we will rise to the final place, the center of all things, the Empyrean, where God is. I'll see you there. Bye-bye.